I was standing on $20,000 marble countertops when I realized the man I'd slept next to for 10 years wasn't just cheating on me, he was erasing me. I found the folder in his briefcase. It wasn't a divorce settlement. It was a liquidation agreement to sell my father's legacy to the very men who killed him. Marcus thought he'd trapped a bird in a golden cage. He didn't realize he'd just locked himself in a room with a woman who has nothing left to lose. But here's the part that should terrify you. The signature on the intent to sell wasn't a forgery. It was mine. And I have no memory of signing it. New York City doesn't sleep, but it does watch. It watches from the floor to ceiling windows of the penthouses in Tribeca. It watches from the pavement of the side streets in Brooklyn. For 10 years, I thought I was the one looking out at that skyline, admiring the way the sunset bled orange and violet over the Hudson. I thought I had conquered it. But really, I was just a bird in a very expensive, very silent cage. My name is Elena. And before the world knew me as the woman who broke the New York real estate market, I was just a wife, a partner, a fool. Today, I'm going to tell you how I lost a $40 million empire in a single afternoon, and why it was the most liberating breath of air I've ever taken. The air in the penthouse always smelled like expensive lilies and filtered oxygen. Marcus liked it that way. He used to say, "Elena, we worked too hard to breathe the same air as the people on the subway." I used to nod. I used to think that was love. I didn't realize it was isolation. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday was our check-in night. No phones, no business, just us. I was standing in our kitchen, my hand resting on the $20,000 Italian marble countertops. The stone was cold. Marcus was late. Again. Traffic, he would say. Or the closing ran long. But that night, the silence in the apartment didn't feel peaceful. I walked over to the hallway closet to hang up my blazer. That's when I saw his briefcase. Marcus was never careless, but he had left it unlocked, a thick folder peeking out from the leather lip. I reached out, intending to just tuck the papers back in. My fingers brushed the header of a document. The logo at the top of the page made the blood go cold in my veins. Sterling Holdings. Sterling Holdings was the firm that had aggressively tried to bankrupt my father 20 years ago. They were the wolves at the door that drove him into an early grave. I had spent my entire career building Elena and Associates specifically to stay independent of them. I pulled the document out. It wasn't a merger. It was a liquidation agreement. Marcus hadn't been closing deals. He had been negotiating the secret sale of my firm, my grandfather's legacy, to my greatest enemy. And the signature on the intent to sell line? It wasn't mine. It was a perfect forgery of my handwriting, witnessed and notarized by our private notary, a man Marcus had been playing golf with for years. There's a specific kind of shock that acts like a vacuum. It sucks all the air out of your lungs so fast that you can't even produce a tear. I just stood there, in my silent hallway, holding a piece of evidence that my husband was dismantling my life's work brick by brick. I heard the front door lock click. I shoved the papers back. I moved to the kitchen island just as Marcus walked in. He looked perfect. He always looked perfect. "Hey babe," he said, not looking at me. He headed straight for the bar. "Long day. We're finally seeing some light on that Jersey City project." I watched him pour a drink. I watched the way his hands, the same hands that had held mine at my father's funeral, moved with such casual indifference. "Is that all you're working on, Marcus?" I asked. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "Of course," he replied, taking a sip. "Why would I be working on anything else? You're the visionary, Elena. I'm just the guy who keeps the lights on." The guy who keeps the lights on? No. He was the guy waiting for the sun to go down so he could rob the house blind. I'm going to tell you exactly what I did next. I'm going to tell you how I sat across from him at dinner and watched him lie to my face while he planned to leave me with nothing but a signed confession of bankruptcy. But before I do, I want you to look at your own life. Are you sure the person sleeping next to you isn't just waiting for you to build something big enough for them to steal? Most of you watching this will think, that could never happen to me. You'll stay silent, you won't subscribe, and you'll go about your day. But karma is a collector, and she always comes for her due. If you want to be on the right side of the story, subscribe now. If you're too afraid of the truth, well, stay in the comments and lament about why you'd rather live in the dark. I'm reading everything. That night, Marcus fell asleep within minutes. I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that logo. Sterling. I didn't wake him up. Instead, I got out of bed. I went to my home office. I sat down at my desk, the city lights flickering like dying stars outside my window. I opened my private ledger. Day 1. I whispered to the empty room. The mask is off. I realized then that Marcus didn't just want the money. He wanted to hand my father's ghost over to the men who killed him. I always told my students at Columbia that a building doesn't collapse because of a single gust of wind. It collapses because of structural fatigue, tiny, microscopic fractures in the load-bearing beams that go unnoticed for years until the weight of the world finally becomes too much. As I sat in that library safe, my phone trembling in my hand as I scrolled through the digital trail Marcus had left behind, I realized he had been my structural fatigue. He hadn't just attacked me. He had been eroding me from the inside out for 36 months. The first thing I found was the Project Phoenix ledger. On the surface, Phoenix was supposed to be our landmark affordable housing project in Harlem. It was my passion project, a way to give back to the city that gave my grandfather a chance, but Marcus had turned it into a financial black hole. He had set up a series of Tier 2 subcontractors. On paper, these were construction firms, plumbing specialists, and electrical engineers. But when I looked at the corporate filings for these companies, Vanguard Steel, Blue Anchor Electric, Pillar Masonry, they all led back to the same P.O. box in Delaware. They weren't companies, they were ghosts. Marcus was overbilling the firm for materials that were never delivered. We were buying premium grade A steel from Vanguard, but the invoices were 40% above market rate. That extra 40%? It wasn't going to a supplier. It was being kicked back into Apex Consulting, the shell company Marcus controlled. I looked at the change order logs. In architecture, a change order is a standard document used to track modifications to a project's original plan. Marcus had filed over 200 of them in 6 months. Each one was a tiny leak. $5,000 for soil stabilization, $12,000 for permitting delays, $8,000 for structural consultations. Alone, they looked like the cost of doing business in New York. Together, they were a coordinated siphon. He was bleeding the firm's liquidity dry so that our debt-to-income ratio would trigger a default warning from our primary lenders. But the sabotage went deeper than just theft. It was reputational. I found a folder labeled Correspondence, Sterling, Marcus. Inside were emails he thought he had deleted. He was sending Sterling Holdings, the very people who had crushed my father, our confidential bid templates. He was giving them our internal price to win data. Every time Elena and Associates lost a major contract over the last year, it wasn't because our designs were inferior. It was because Sterling knew exactly what our bid was, and they were undercutting us by a mere 1%. Marcus was handing them the keys to my kingdom while I was busy trying to build the walls. "You bastard," I whispered to the empty library. He was setting up a predatory buyout. By draining our cash reserves and losing us our biggest contracts, he was forcing the firm into a position where we couldn't pay our payroll. And then, like a hero, he would suggest we sell a majority stake to Sterling Holdings to save the employees. And the kicker? The intent to sell agreement I found earlier was tied to a climax clause. If the firm were sold due to financial mismanagement, Marcus, as the managing director, would receive a 15% performance bonus from the buyer. He wasn't just selling my legacy, he was getting a tip for doing it. I looked at the clock. 9:45 a.m. I had 3 hours before my lunch meeting with the board. I didn't have time to cry. I didn't have time to feel the weight of his betrayal. I had to become an architect of a different kind. I had to build a trap. I reached out to an old contact, a forensic accountant who owed my father a lifelong debt. "I need a shadow ledger," I told him when he picked up. "I need you to map every dollar that went into Apex Consulting. And I need it to look like I haven't noticed. Can you create a honeypot file?" A honeypot is a decoy. I wanted Marcus to think he was still successfully stealing. I wanted him to see a fresh drawdown on our accounts that would make his eyes light up with greed. I wanted him to move for the kill, thinking I was at my weakest. Because there's one thing Marcus forgot. He's a businessman. He understands spreadsheets and contracts. But I am an architect. I understand physics. I know that if you remove the wrong brick, the whole structure doesn't just fall. It crushes whoever is standing beneath it. That afternoon, I walked into the office. I saw Marcus standing by the espresso machine, laughing with Sarah, our legal consultant. She was holding a pen, the same pen she probably used to help him forge my name on the Sterling documents. "Elena," Marcus called out, his smile bright and hollow. "You look tired, honey. Why don't you take the afternoon off? Sarah and I can handle the auditors." I looked at Sarah. I saw the way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear. I saw the way she looked at my office door, not with respect but with ownership. "No," I said, my voice as smooth as polished glass. "I think I'll stay. I have some structural adjustments to make to our future plans." I walked past them, and for the first time in 10 years, I didn't feel like a bird in a cage. I felt like a wolf in a suit. They say the truth will set you free, but they never tell you how much it hurts when that truth is a jagged blade pulling out of your back. It was Thursday, exactly 48 hours after I found the Project Phoenix ledger. I was sitting in my office, the one with the view of the Chrysler Building, trying to focus on a blueprint for a new museum in Doha, but the lines wouldn't stay straight. Every time I looked at a structural column, I saw Marcus's face. Every time I looked at a foundation, I saw the ghost of my father. The door to my office didn't open. It exploded. Marcus walked in, but he wasn't the man I had eaten dinner with the night before. Gone was the doting husband. Gone was the business manager who just wanted to keep the lights on. He was flanked by Sarah and 2 men in dark charcoal suits I had never seen before. They carried briefcases like they were weapons. "Elena," Marcus said. His voice was cold, surgical. "We need to talk. And you're going to want to sit down." I didn't sit. I stood up, my spine mimicking the steel beams I had spent my life designing. "Marcus? Who are these people? We have a design review in 10 minutes. "The review is cancelled," Sarah said. She stepped forward, avoiding my eyes. She was holding a blue litigation folder. "Elena, as legal counsel for Elena and Associates, I have a duty to the board. And the board has concerns." "The board?" I whispered. "I am the board, Sarah. I own 60% of this company." Marcus stepped into my personal space. I could smell his expensive cologne, the one I bought him for Christmas. It felt like a physical assault. "Not anymore, Elena," he said, dropping a thick stack of documents onto my desk. "We've just come from an emergency session. Due to the irregularities in the Project Phoenix accounts, specifically the unauthorized drawdowns on the employee pension funds, the board has moved to freeze your voting rights. They believe you've been, shall we say, mentally compromised by the stress of the firm's recent losses." There it was. The gaslighting had finally reached its final form. He wasn't just stealing the money. He was stealing my sanity. "I didn't touch those funds, Marcus. You know that. You handle the disbursements," I said, my voice rising. He sighed, a patronizing, theatrical sound. "The signatures say otherwise, Elena. We have the digital logs. We have the notarized authorizations. It looks like you've been trying to hide the firm's insolvency by dipping into the one thing that's sacred in this industry. The employees' futures." He looked at the 2 men in suits. "These gentlemen are from the SEC's investigative wing. They aren't here for me. They're here for you." I looked at Sarah. "You helped him do this. You knew about the Sterling deal. You knew about the shell companies." Sarah finally looked at me, and what I saw in her eyes wasn't guilt. It was ambition. "Sterling is the only way to save this firm from the mess you made, Elena. Marcus is doing what's necessary. You're the one who lost touch with reality." Marcus leaned over my desk, his face inches from mine. "Here's how this goes, Elena. You sign the voluntary handover. You go to a wellness retreat in Vermont for 6 months. We announce that you're stepping back for health reasons. In exchange, I make the SEC investigation go away. Sterling buys the firm. The pensions are restored by their capital injection and everyone wins." "And if I don't?" I asked. "Then I hand over the evidence of your embezzlement to the district attorney. You won't be going to Vermont. You'll be going to Rikers. And I'll still get the firm, because as your husband and primary beneficiary, I'll be appointed as your legal conservator." He had built a cage so perfect, there wasn't a single gap in the bars. If I fought him, I went to jail. If I surrendered, he gave my father's legacy to the wolves. I looked down at the papers. My hand was shaking, not from fear though I was terrified, but from a cold crystalline fury that was starting to settle in my marrow. Marcus handed me a pen. It was a Mont Blanc, a gift from Sterling Holdings, no doubt. "Sign it, Elena, for your own good." I picked up the pen. I looked at the intent to resign line. And then I did something Marcus didn't expect. I laughed. What's so funny? Marcus snapped. I said, looking him dead in the eye. You've spent so much time looking at the numbers on the screen, Marcus. You forgot to look at the ground beneath your feet. I didn't sign. I stood up and walked toward the door. Where are you going? He shouted. The SEC is right here. Then they can follow me to the courthouse, I said, not turning back. Because I'm not signing a resignation. I'm filing for a predatory divorce. And Marcus? Since you're so fond of the books, I hope you're prepared for the audit of a lifetime. I walked out of that office. I walked past my crying assistant. I walked out into the New York air, which felt like ice against my skin. I had 15 minutes to get to my lawyer, the real one. The one Marcus didn't know about. Because I hadn't just been taking photos of the safe. I had been planting a logic bomb in the firm's financial servers. If Marcus tried to finalize the sterling deal before the sun went down, he wouldn't just be selling a company. He would be triggering an automatic disclosure to every major bank in the city. The battle hadn't just begun. I had just pulled the pin on a grenade and left it sitting on my own desk. The walk from my office to the subway was only 6 blocks, but in that time, my world didn't just change, it vanished. By the time I reached the turnstile, my company email had been deactivated. By the time I reached my stop, my personal credit cards had been flagged for suspicious activity. Marcus wasn't just fighting me, he was erasing me. I sat on a park bench in Union Square, the rain soaking through my silk blazer. People rushed past, their umbrellas forming a colorful canopy of indifference. No one knew that the woman sitting there, shivering, was as of 10 minutes ago the CEO of one of the most prestigious architecture firms in the country. Or at least, I had been. I pulled my phone from my pocket. It was buzzing incessantly. Notifications from news alerts. Marcus hadn't waited for the wellness retreat cover story. Breaking, Elena and Associates faces SEC inquiry. Founder Elena V steps down amid allegations of financial mismanagement. He had leaked it. He had burned the house down while I was still standing in the foyer. I leaned my head back against the cold metal of the bench and closed my eyes. I thought about my father. I remembered the day he took me to the top of the Empire State Building when I was 7. He pointed at the horizon and said, "Elena, look at the geometry. Everything in this city is held together by tension. If you want to build something that lasts, you have to learn to love the pressure." I didn't feel like I loved the pressure. I felt like I was being crushed. I realized I couldn't go back to the penthouse. Marcus would have the locks changed by now. He'd probably have the doorman instructed to call the police if I showed my face. Everything I owned, my clothes, my sketches, my mother's pearls, was behind a door I no longer had the key to. I felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't just the money. It was the intimacy of the betrayal. How many nights had we sat on that balcony, drinking wine and talking about the future? How many times had I leaned on him when a project went over budget? Every "I love you now" felt like a premeditated lie. Every kiss was just a distraction so he could reach for my wallet. I looked at my reflection in a puddle at my feet. I looked old. I looked like a ghost. But then I saw it. Underneath the exhaustion, there was a spark. It was the same spark I had when I was 22 and a senior architect told me I'd never make it in a man's world. Marcus thought he had stripped me of my assets. He forgot that my greatest asset wasn't the firm, or the penthouse, or the bank accounts. It was my mind. And he couldn't freeze that. I stood up, wiping the rain from my face. I had exactly $12 in cash and a phone with 14% battery. I walked 3 blocks to a dingy 24-hour diner, the kind of place Marcus would never be caught dead in. I ordered a black coffee and asked to use their charger. I didn't call a lawyer yet. I called a man named Elias. Elias was a fixer for the old-school architectural unions. He was the man you called when a building was about to collapse and you needed to save the people inside before the news crews arrived. "Elena?" Elias's voice was gravelly. "I saw the news. Are you okay?" "I'm alive, Elias," I said, watching the steam rise from my cup. "But I need a place to stay. Somewhere off the grid. And I need a burner phone." "You're going underground?" "No," I whispered, my eyes narrowing. "I'm going into the foundation. I need to see the things Marcus thinks he buried." That night, I stayed in a small, windowless room above a hardware store in Queens. The smell of sawdust and oil was a stark contrast to the lilies of the penthouse. It was honest. It was raw. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, mapping out every move Marcus had made. I realized he had a weakness. He was a narcissist of the highest order. He believed he was the smartest person in the room because he had managed to trick me. He thought the game was over because he had the documents. But he didn't realize I had been playing a different game for months. As the sun began to peek through the grime on the window, I pulled out a small leather-bound notebook I had kept in my blazer pocket. In it were the private access codes to the Project Phoenix offshore servers. Marcus thought he had deleted the trail. He thought he had moved the money to Apex Consulting and wiped the logs. What he didn't know was that I had installed a mirror drive on the firm's main server 6 months ago, disguised as a routine security update. Every time he forged a signature, every time he moved a dollar, it was being recorded on a server located in a small data center in Reykjavik. He wanted to play the mentally unstable card. Fine. Let's see how stable he looks when the feds realize he's been laundering money through a fake housing project for 3 years. I didn't just have his secrets. I had his soul. The room in Queens smelled like iron and old paper. It was the antithesis of the glass towers I was used to. There were no assistants to bring me water, no high-speed fiber optics, just me, a dusty laptop Elias had scrounged up, and a connection that flickered like a dying candle. But in the dark you see things you missed in the light. Marcus had spent 3 years building a labyrinth. He thought he was the minotaur at the center, waiting to devour me. What he forgot is that I'm the one who designed the maze. I finally bypassed the secondary firewall of the Apex Consulting shell company. Most people, when they steal, they try to hide the money in a far-off land. Marcus was more arrogant. He hid the money in plain sight, using a technique called structuring. He was moving small amounts, always under $10,000, to avoid federal reporting triggers, into dozens of different accounts. But as I looked at the transaction history, a pattern emerged. These weren't just random accounts. Each one was tied to a specific consultant fee. And when I cross-referenced the names of these consultants with the Sterling Holdings executive board, I felt my blood turn to liquid nitrogen. Marcus wasn't just selling my firm to Sterling. He was buying his way into it. He had been using my company's profits to pay the personal debts of the Sterling board members. He was literally bribing the wolves with the meat from my own table so that when the buyout happened, he wouldn't just be an employee, he'd be a partner. He was trading my grandfather's name for a seat at the table of the men who destroyed him. I felt a physical pain in my chest. It wasn't just a financial hit anymore. It was a desecration. My father had died with my name on his lips, begging me to keep the firm independent, to keep the Sterling rot out of our designs. And Marcus had invited them in through the back door while I was sleeping in the next room. But then I found the glitch. In every complex system, there is a vulnerability. Marcus was a master of the macro, but he was sloppy with the micro. To hide the bribe payments, he had to categorize them as maintenance fees for our Jersey City development project. To make those fees look legitimate, he had to generate physical work orders. I pulled up the digital copies of those work orders, thousands of them, and there it was. Every single work order for Vanguard Steel, his primary ghost company, had been timestamped from a server located in his personal home office at the penthouse. Not the corporate office. Not a satellite site. Our home. While I was in the kitchen making us dinner, he was in the next room, forging the documents that would ruin me. He didn't even have the decency to do it at a distance. He did it while he could hear me hum my favorite song. "You were so close, Marcus," I whispered to the screen. "But you were too lazy to leave the house." I began to compile the master file. I didn't just want to prove he was a thief. I wanted to prove conspiracy to defraud. In New York, that carries a mandatory minimum that a wellness retreat won't fix. I worked through the night, my eyes burning from the blue light. I mapped the flow of money from the employee pension fund, through the Apex shell, and directly into the offshore accounts of 3 Sterling executives. I had enough to put him away. But I realized that wasn't enough for me. If I went to the police now, the firm would be tied up in litigation for a decade. The employees would still lose their jobs. The Elena and Associates name would be dragged through the mud of a criminal trial. I didn't just want him in a cell. I wanted him to lose the thing he loved most. I wanted him to see the golden life he had built on my back turn into a heap of ash. I reached out to Maya, my assistant, via an encrypted messaging app. "Maya. Don't answer. Just listen." I need the Project Phoenix blueprints. The real ones. The ones in the blue vault in my desk. Can you get them out? A minute passed. Then two. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Elena? Thank God. Marcus is clearing out your office. He's shredding everything. I have the files. Where do I go? The pieces were moving. Marcus thought the queen was off the board. He didn't realize I was just waiting for him to move his king into the open. The meeting point was a derelict pier in Long Island City, a place where the wind off the East River smells like salt and forgotten dreams. It was midnight. I stood in the shadow of a rusted shipping container, wearing an oversized hoodie I'd bought at a bodega for $10. I didn't look like the woman on the cover of Architectural Digest anymore. I looked like a ghost. When a pair of headlights flickered in the distance, my heart hammered against my ribs. Voice drops to a whisper. In this game, trust is a liability. I had to ask myself, was Maya still on my side? Or had Marcus offered her a promotion to be the one who delivered the final blow? The car slowed to a crawl. The door opened, and Maya stepped out. She looked pale, her eyes darting around the empty pier. She was clutching a heavy weatherproof architect's tube to her chest like a newborn child. Elena, she called out, her voice thin. I stepped out of the shadows. Did anyone follow you? I took 3 different Ubers, she whispered, her hands shaking as she handed me the tube. Marcus is losing it, Elena. He's fired half the senior staff. He's bringing in consultants from Sterling to redo the entire Project Phoenix plan. He told the press you had a nervous breakdown and tried to burn the archives. He's projecting, I said, taking the tube. He's the one who's about to feel the heat. I opened the tube and pulled out the blueprints. These weren't the digital files Marcus had been adjusting on his home computer. These were the original, hand-drafted structural schematics for the Harlem project, signed by the city's lead engineers before Marcus ever touched the books. I laid them out on the hood of Maya's car, using a flashlight to scan the footer notes. Look here, I pointed to the load-bearing specifications for the foundation. Marcus has been telling the city we're using grade 8 industrial steel. But look at the procurement orders he's been signing for Vanguard steel lately. Maya peered closer. The price is for grade 8, but the serial numbers, they don't match. Exactly, I whispered. He's been charging the city for premium materials and installing structural grade 3. It's cheaper, thinner, and completely illegal for a building of this height. He's not just stealing money, Maya. He's building a death trap. If that building goes up as he's planned it, it won't stand for 5 years. This was my first small victory. I didn't just have a financial crime. I had a public safety endangerment charge. In New York, that's not something a high-priced lawyer can make vanish with a dinner and a handshake. Maya, I need you to do one more thing. I need the login for the on-site construction cameras. Marcus thinks he's blocked my IP, but I know the backdoor password the installers used. I can get it, she said, a new spark of defiance in her eyes. But Elena, Sarah is everywhere. She's moved into your office. She's even wearing your favorite scarf. Let her enjoy it. It's the last warm thing she'll feel for a long time. I watched Maya drive away, leaving me alone with the blueprints and the wind. For the first time since the golden cage shattered, I felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't the warm, fuzzy kind. It was cold. It was the hope of a sniper who finally has the target in the crosshairs. I went back to the room in Queens and spent the next 6 hours linking the serial numbers of the cheap steel to the kickback payments in the Apex Consulting account. The money trail and the material trail were finally converging. I sent an anonymous tip to the city building inspector, not with the whole story, but with just enough red flags to trigger a mandatory site audit for the following morning. Marcus was planning a grand groundbreaking ceremony for Sterling Holdings tomorrow at 10 a.m. He wanted the cameras there. He wanted the prestige. Go ahead, Marcus, I whispered to the empty room, my finger hovering over the send button on the final data packet. Invite the world to see your masterpiece. I'll make sure they see exactly what's underneath it. The morning of the groundbreaking ceremony was a Chamber of Commerce day, crisp, blue, and deceptively beautiful. From my vantage point in a parked utility van 3 blocks away, I watched the live stream on a tablet. There he was, Marcus, standing on a literal pedestal in the middle of the Harlem site, wearing a white hard hat that had never seen a speck of dust. Beside him stood the CEO of Sterling Holdings, Arthur Sterling, a man whose face looked like it had been carved out of a tombstone. And of course, Sarah. She was radiant, holding the ceremonial golden shovel as if she were the one who had spent years calculating the wind load of a skyscraper. Marcus stepped up to the microphone. Today? He beamed, his voice echoing through the speakers. We don't just break ground. We break the cycle of mismanagement. We bring stability to Harlem. We bring the future. I checked the GPS on my phone. The building inspector's car was 2 minutes away. The trap was set. The material trail I had leaked was enough to halt the project. But what happened next was something I hadn't planned for. Something that made my heart stop. A black SUV pulled up to the edge of the VIP tent. A man stepped out. He wasn't a city official. He wasn't a lawyer. He was someone I hadn't seen in 15 years. It was my brother, Julian. Julian had been the black sheep of the family. He had vanished after my father's funeral, taking his inheritance and a mountain of resentment with him. We hadn't spoken since he accused me of hoarding the firm's legacy. But there he was, walking right up to Marcus. I expected a fight. I expected a scene. Instead, Marcus reached out and shook his hand. They hugged. They hugged like old friends. I want to thank our newest partner, Marcus announced to the crowd, Julian V., who has graciously sold his remaining shares and family land rights to Sterling Holdings, giving us the final 10% we needed for total site control. I felt the air leave my lungs. Julian didn't just sell out. He had been the silent partner in Marcus's shell company. The Apex Consulting account wasn't just Marcus's piggy bank, it was the funnel Julian had been using to reclaim what he thought was his. My own brother had helped Marcus dismantle our father's life work. The structural fatigue wasn't just in the buildings, it was in my DNA. I sat back in the dark van, the tablet screen flickering. I realized then that I wasn't fighting a husband and a mistress. I was fighting a family coup. Marcus looked into the camera, and for a split second, I felt like he was looking directly at me through the lens. He smiled, that thin, predatory curve of the lips. Elena, if you're watching. His voice seemed to drop an octave. Thanks for the blueprints. We've made some improvements. The building inspector's car arrived, but as the officials stepped out, Julian stepped forward to meet them. He handed them a folder. I watched the inspectors look at the papers, look at the site, and then, they shook Julian's hand. They didn't stop the ceremony. They didn't cordon off the site. They had a corrected certification. Julian had used his family authority to retroactively validate the cheap steel as a technical experimental substitute. I had been outplayed. My small victory had been turned into a public execution of my credibility. I closed the tablet. The van was silent, save for the sound of my own ragged breathing. Okay, Julian, I whispered, my eyes turning to flint. You want to play the family card? Let's talk about the inheritance clause Dad left in the original charter. The one you were too high to read. I shifted the van into gear. I didn't drive away. I drove toward the one place Marcus and Julian wouldn't expect me. I drove toward the Sterling Holdings headquarters. If you can't stop the wolves, you have to become the one who feeds them. And I had a meal for Arthur Sterling that would make him choke on his own greed. They say the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But in the world of Manhattan real estate, the enemy of my enemy is simply a shark that hasn't eaten yet. I stood in the lobby of the Sterling Tower. I looked like a ghost, wet, pale, and wearing a $10 hoodie, but I walked past the security desk with the authority of a woman who owned the ground they were standing on. I didn't ask for a meeting. I didn't wait for an invite. I walked straight to the executive elevator and punched in a code that hadn't been changed since 1994. 0712. My father's birthday. Arthur Sterling was a man of habit. He kept the code as a trophy, a reminder of the day he thought he'd finally broken my father. When the doors opened on the 60th floor, he was standing by the window, looking out at the city he thought he had conquered. You have exactly 60 seconds before I call security, Elena, Arthur said, not even turning around. You'll want 90, I replied, my voice as steady as a structural beam. Because Marcus and Julian aren't just giving you my firm, they're giving you a poison pill that will bankrupt Sterling Holdings by the end of the fiscal year. Sit down, he muttered. I didn't sit. I walked to his mahogany desk and laid out a single piece of paper. It wasn't a blueprint. It was a secondary liability clause buried in the original foundation rights of the Harlem site rights that my father had never sold. and that Julian didn't actually own. Julian sold you the land rights, I said, leaning in. But he only owned the surface rights. My father, in his paranoia, split the deed. The subsurface rights, the ones that allow you to dig a foundation deeper than 10 feet, are held in a trust that only triggers upon the unauthorized attempted liquidation of the firm. Arthur's face didn't change, but I saw his fingers twitch. And who controls that trust? I do, I whispered. Which means that right now, Marcus and Julian are building your $40 million project on land you have no legal right to excavate. The moment you pour that first ton of concrete, you are committing a felony trespass against a private trust. Marcus is greedy, Arthur. He told you he had total control because he wanted that 15% kickback. Julian is desperate, he just wanted to hurt me. But neither of them actually read the fine print of my father's will. They were too busy measuring the drapes in my office. I watched the realization sink in. Arthur Sterling didn't care about my marriage. He didn't care about my mental health. He cared about his balance sheet. If the Harlem project was halted by a title dispute after he'd already invested millions, Sterling Holdings would be sued into oblivion by their own investors. What do you want, Elena? Arthur asked, his voice a low rasp. I want Marcus erased, I said. I want the SEC investigation into me dropped. And I want the evidence of Julian's involvement in the Apex Shell Company handed over to the DA. In exchange, I'll sign over the subsurface rights to Sterling. For a price. And that price? I smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it wasn't a mask. I want to be the one who serves Marcus the papers. I want to see the look on his face when he realizes that the partner he betrayed me for is now the one holding his leash. Look at Arthur. He's a shark, and even he's impressed. Most of you would have gone to a lawyer and spent 5 years in a courtroom, losing everything to legal fees. You would have played by the rules. But the rules were written by the people who want to keep you in that cage. Subscribe now if you're ready to stop being a victim and start being the architect of your own justice. If you don't, well, I hope your surface rights are enough to keep you afloat. Tell me in the comments, would you team up with your worst enemy to take down a traitor? As I walked out of the Sterling Tower, the rain had stopped. The city felt different, sharper, clearer. I had made a deal with the devil. But in New York, the devil at least signs a contract. I had 48 hours before the execution began. I didn't go back to the room in Queens. I went to a hotel under an assumed name, ordered a steak, and began to draft the final list of assets Marcus thought he was taking. Because the poison pill wasn't just in the land. It was in the account ledger I had modified before I left the office. Marcus was about to find out that owning a company isn't the same as controlling it. The transition from prey to predator is a quiet one. It doesn't happen with a roar, it happens with a signature. It was Monday morning, precisely 9 a.m. Marcus was at the head of the boardroom table at Elena and Associates, sitting in my chair. He had his feet up on my desk, a cup of artisanal coffee in his hand, and Sarah by his side. They were looking at a digital projection of the new Sterling-Elena merger. To them, the world was a map they had already conquered. Then, the door opened. I didn't walk in alone. I was flanked by 2 men in dark suits from the Sterling legal department and a court-appointed bailiff. Marcus didn't even stand up at first. He just smirked. Elena. I thought we discussed this. He said, his voice dripping with forced pity. The security downstairs is going to lose their jobs for letting an unstable ex-employee into the executive suite. I'm not an employee, Marcus, I said, leaning over the table. I slid a blue folder across the mahogany. And you're not the CEO. You're the primary debtor. Marcus frowned, picking up the document. As he read, the smirk didn't just fade, it curdled. What is this? He stammered. A recall of corporate liabilities. You can't do this. I didn't do it, Marcus, I whispered. You did. When you forged my name on those Project Phoenix drawdown requests, you didn't just take the money. You signed an unlimited personal guarantee on the bridge loans that funded them. You thought you were stealing from the firm, but the way you structured the Apex Shell Company, you technically made those loans personal liabilities. Marcus looked at Sarah. She was already backing away from him, her face turning a ghostly shade of white. And here's the shocker. I continued, my voice gaining a razor edge. Sterling Holdings didn't buy the firm this morning. They bought your debt. They now own every penny you owe. And they've appointed me as the special conservator to collect. Marcus stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. Arthur wouldn't do that. We had a deal. Arthur Sterling is a businessman, Marcus, I said. And I gave him a better deal. I gave him the land subsurface rights for free, in exchange for your soul. He realized that owning a debt-ridden traitor like you was much more profitable than being your partner. But the real shock wasn't the money. The bailiff stepped forward. Marcus Fiff. I have a warrant for your arrest. Not for the embezzlement, but for the industrial sabotage of the Harlem site. Marcus blinked, confused. What? I fixed the steel certification. Julian handled it. Julian didn't handle anything, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. Julian was never on your side, Marcus. He was the one who sent me the Project Phoenix blueprints 3 weeks ago. He's been working with me since the day you first approached him to betray me. Julian walked into the room then. He wasn't the black sheep anymore. He was wearing a suit that looked better than Marcus's. He didn't look at Marcus. He walked straight to me and handed me a thumb drive. Everything's on here, sis, Julian said. Every recording of him talking about erasing you. Every conversation about the bribes. Marcus collapsed back into the chair. The man who thought he had built a maze was realizing he was the only one trapped inside it. He looked at Sarah, searching for an ally, but she was already grabbing her coat. Don't bother, Sarah, I said. The SEC is waiting for you in the lobby. It turns out, being a legal consultant for a fraud is a very short career path. As the police led Marcus out of my office, he tried to scream, but the words died in his throat. He looked small. He looked like the bird in the cage now. I walked over to the window and looked out at the city. The Chrysler building was gleaming. Is it over? Julian asked, standing beside me. No, I whispered, watching the police car pull away from the curb. The execution is finished. Now, the retaliation begins. Reclaiming a kingdom is messier than building one. When you build, you start with a clean slate. When you reclaim, you have to scrub the blood and the grease off the walls first. Marcus was in a holding cell at the first precinct, but his ghost was still haunting the halls of Elena and Associates. His consultants were still at their desks, his forged contracts were still in the filing cabinets, and the sterling rot was still pulsing through the company's veins. I stood in the center of the bullpen. My employees were staring at me. Some with hope, some with fear, and many with the deep, hollow exhaustion of people who had been forced to choose between their ethics and their paychecks. Attention everyone, I said. I didn't use a microphone. I didn't need to. The silence that followed was absolute. For the last 6 months, this firm has been operated as a criminal enterprise. That ends today. I pointed to the 2 men from the Sterling audit team. These men are not here to help you. They are here to find out who was complicit. If you helped Marcus or Sarah forge documents, move funds or hide safety reports, you have exactly 1 hour to come to my office and disclose it. If you do, I will consider it a resignation with a modest severance. If you don't, and we find your digital thumbprint, the SEC will be your next employer. I watched the color drain from at least 5 faces in the front row. They didn't wait an hour. They started moving toward the elevators immediately. Maya, I turned to my assistant. I want a full systems reboot. Every password, every access code, every biometric lock. If Marcus's name is on it, delete it. If his consultants are logged in, lock them out. Now. The execution wasn't just about firing people. It was about systemic purge. I had to decouple the firm from the Apex shell company once and for all. This meant triggering a reversionary interest clause in our insurance policies, a technical move that would shift the liability for the Harlem site's structural failures onto Marcus personally, while protecting the firm's assets. But as I sat at my desk, looking at the master ledger, I realized Marcus had left one final trap, a dead man's switch in our primary server. If the Apex account balance hit 0, which it did the moment I seized it, it triggered an automatic email to every client we had, including the Prime Minister of Qatar and the New York City Housing Authority. The email contained evidence of my mental instability and a series of deepfake audio clips Marcus had created using AI, making it sound like I was admitting to bribing city officials. He wasn't just trying to take the company. He was trying to salt the earth so nothing would ever grow here again. Julian, I called out. My brother appeared in the doorway, looking at the chaotic screen. He's leaking the deep fakes. If those reach the press, the Sterling deal won't matter. The Elena brand will be radioactive. Julian didn't panic. He sat down at the terminal next to me. He's using a delayed SMTP server in Switzerland. We can't stop the emails from sending, but we can poison the data. How? We inject a corrupted header into the attachments, Julian explained, his fingers flying across the keys. The emails will arrive, but the audio files and evidence will be unreadable gibberish. By the time they fix the corruption, we'll have the official SEC statement debunking the whole thing. It was a race against a ghost. We watched the progress bar. 45%, 62%, 88%. Done, Julian whispered. The files are junk. The only thing they'll see is a bunch of code. I leaned back in my chair. The leather still felt cold, but the air in the room was finally starting to clear. But then my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I answered. Hello? Elena, a woman's voice said. It wasn't Sarah. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years. It was Marcus's mother. You think you've won? You think you can just throw my son in a cage and take his life? You forgot who actually funded Apex in the beginning, dear. You forgot about the family trust. They say that when you pull a weed, you have to get the root, or it just grows back stronger. I thought Marcus was the root. I thought he was the architect of my misery. But as I sat in my office, listening to the voice of Beatrice, my mother-in-law, I realized Marcus was just a branch. Beatrice was a woman of old Greenwich money and even older grudges. She had always looked at me not as a daughter-in-law but as a temporary steward of the Vane family potential. The family trust, Beatrice. I whispered into the phone. I've seen the books. Your family trust was liquidated 10 years ago to pay for Marcus's failed venture in London. There is no trust. Oh, Elena. You're such a brilliant architect, but you're so blind to the soil you build on, Beatrice said, her voice sounding like silk over a razor. The trust wasn't liquid cash. It was collateralized debt. And that debt? It's held against the very land your father gifted you. Marcus didn't forge your name on the Apex documents alone. He had the original power of attorney your father signed over to me 25 years ago. My heart stopped. 25 years ago, when my father was at his lowest fighting off Sterling Holdings, he had taken a private loan from the Vane family. I knew about the loan, but I thought it had been paid back. My father paid that off, I snapped. I saw the receipts. He paid the interest, dear. Never the principal, Beatrice purred. And the principal has been compounding. Why do you think Marcus married you? Out of love? He married you to keep the debt in the family, but now that you've turned on him, the debt is due. And I'm calling it in. Tomorrow morning, I'm filing a superior lien on every asset Elena and Associates owns. I hung up the phone. My hand was shaking so violently I dropped it onto the mahogany desk. The desk my father had built. The desk where I had signed my first multi-million-dollar contract. I felt a wave of nausea. Every memory of my marriage, the quiet mornings, the shared dreams, the way Marcus held me when my father died was being rewritten in real time. It wasn't just a betrayal of the present. It was a retroactive heist of my entire adult life. I wasn't just his wife. I was his collateral. Julian walked in, seeing the state I was in. Elena? What did she say? She has a lien, Julian, I said, my voice sounding hollow like a bell rung underwater. A superior lien from Dad's $1,999 loan. If she files it, Sterling Holdings will pull out of the deal. They won't touch a firm with a clouded title. We'll be bankrupt by noon tomorrow. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The city looked blurred through the rain. I felt like I was standing on the edge of one of my own skyscrapers, watching the ground rush up to meet me. There has to be a way out, Julian said, pacing the room. Dad was a genius. He wouldn't have left us this vulnerable. He didn't think he was being vulnerable, I whispered. He thought he was being protected by a friend. He trusted Beatrice. But I am not my father. I don't build on trust anymore. I build on reinforcement. I grabbed my coat. Where are you going? Julian asked. To the jail, I said, my eyes turning into cold gray flint. I need to have a conversation with my husband. If Beatrice wants to play the family trust card, I'm going to show her exactly what happens when the family turns on itself. The visitation room at the precinct smelled like industrial bleach and desperation. It's a smell that sticks to your skin, A reminder that human dignity is a fragile thing. I sat behind the scratched plexiglass, waiting. When the door on the other side opened, Marcus walked in. He wasn't wearing his $5,000 suit anymore. He was in a rough orange jumpsuit that made his skin look sallow. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flash of the man I loved. But then his lips curled into that familiar, arrogant smirk. He picked up the phone. "Come to gloat, Elena?" His voice crackled through the receiver. "Or did my mother finally give you the news? I'm here to give you a choice, Marcus. Not a deal. A choice. You're in no position to give me anything." He laughed, leaning back. "That superior lean Beatrice is holding. It's airtight. It's a cross-collateralized security interest. It doesn't just cover the firm, it covers every personal bank account you have. By this time tomorrow, you'll be as broke as the people you claim to build for in Harlem." I leaned closer to the glass. "You think this is about the money? You still don't get it. I've already moved the intellectual property. What Beatrice is going to seize is a hollow shell, a mountain of debt and a list of lawsuits. But there's something else, Marcus. Something Beatrice doesn't know you did." I went back through the records of the Apex Shell Company. I whispered. "I found the payments you made to the health consultant in Switzerland. The one you've been paying $10,000 a month for the last 2 years. Marcus's face went pale. Not the gray of a man caught in a lie, but the white of a man facing his own ghost. "I thought it was a bribe," I continued. "But then I looked at the medical codes on the wire transfers. Those weren't for a consultant. They were for private memory care. You weren't just stealing to buy a seat at Sterling. You were stealing because you're sick, aren't you?" "Early onset," Marcus finally whispered, his voice cracking for the first time. "It started with the numbers. I'd look at a spreadsheet and they'd move. I couldn't remember my own passwords. I knew if I told you, you'd take over the firm. You'd pity me. I couldn't handle your pity, Elena. I needed to be the one in control before the lights went out for good." I felt a surge of something I didn't want to feel. Compassion. The man who had tried to ruin me wasn't just a monster. He was a terrified man trying to build a fortress before his own mind betrayed him. But then, the anger returned. "So you decided to destroy my life instead? You decided to sell my father's soul to Sterling just so you could have a bigger room in a clinic? I did it for us," he shouted, slamming his hand against the glass. "I wanted to leave you with enough money that you'd never have to work again. Sterling was going to pay me a $40 million exit fee. I was going to set up a trust for you before I forgot who you were." "And Beatrice?" I asked. "Did she know?" "No," Marcus said, his eyes darting to the guard. "She thinks I'm the vain heir she always wanted. If she finds out I'm failing, she'll cut me off. She'll let me rot in this cell." The complication was clear. If I exposed Marcus's condition to invalidate his contracts, I might save the firm, but I'd trigger a total disability clause in our insurance that would allow Beatrice to take immediate legal guardianship of both Marcus and his assets, including his share of the firm. I was stuck. If I fought him, his mother won. If I helped him, he still faced jail. And in the middle of it all, the firm was bleeding out. "There's one more thing, Elena," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly low level. "Beatrice didn't just have the power of attorney from your father. She has the letter. The one your father wrote the night he signed the loan. The one that explains why he needed the money." "What letter?" "The one where he admits that Elena and Associates wasn't founded on his designs." Marcus smiled, a hollow, ghostly version of his former self. "He stole the original blueprints for the firm's first 5 buildings from a rival who died in a convenient accident. If that letter goes public, the Elena legacy isn't just ruined. It's a crime." I stood up, the receiver slipping from my hand. I felt like the floor had finally given way. My father wasn't the hero I thought he was. My husband was a dying man who had tried to save me by stabbing me in the heart. And my mother-in-law was holding a nuclear bomb over my head. I sat in my car outside the precinct for an hour, watching the raindrops race down the glass. The world felt fragile, as if the skyscrapers of Manhattan were made of nothing but balsa wood and lies. My father, the man who taught me that a line must be honest and a foundation must be pure, was a thief. The thought was a physical weight in my chest. If the letter was real, then every award on my shelf, every building with the vain name on it, was a monument to a stolen legacy. But as the clock on the dashboard ticked toward midnight, a memory surfaced. It was a memory of my father in his final days, his hands gnarled and spotted, still clutching a drafting pencil. He had looked at me and said, "Elena, people will try to tell you who I was. They'll try to redefine the ink I put on the page. But remember, a building doesn't lie. Only the people inside it do." I put the car in gear. I didn't go back to the hotel. I didn't go to the office. I drove to the New York Public Library's architecture archives. I still had a master key from my time on the board. I spent 4 hours in the humidity-controlled basement, pulling the original records from 1974, the year my father founded the firm. I found the blueprints for the first 5 buildings Marcus had mentioned. I laid them out on a light table, my eyes scanning every detail. Then, I saw it. The title blocks on the drawings had been altered. Not by my father but by a legal firm representing the Vane Trust Beatrice's family. My father hadn't stolen the designs. He had bought them from a bankrupt architect who was his closest friend. The letter Beatrice was holding wasn't a confession of theft. It was a purchase agreement that had been carefully edited to look like an admission of guilt. Beatrice hadn't just been holding a debt. She had been holding a forgery. She had gaslit Marcus into believing his father-in-law was a criminal, and she had used that lie to drive him into his own spiral of greed. The turning point wasn't finding out my father was a saint. It was finding out my enemy was a fraud. I pulled my phone out and called Julian. "I have the originals, Julian. The real ones." And I found the health consultant Marcus was paying. It wasn't just memory care. He was being treated for arsenic toxicity. "What?" Julian's voice was a jagged whisper. "Marcus isn't naturally sick, Julian," I said, my voice trembling with a new kind of horror. "He's been being slowly poisoned. And the only person who had access to his daily vitamin regimen for the last 2 years was Beatrice. Beatrice didn't want a partner. She didn't even want a son. She wanted a martyr. She wanted Marcus to die of a mysterious illness so she could step in as the grieving grandmother and claim the entire Elena and Associates empire for herself. She was killing her own child to get to my desk. I had the proof. I had the original blueprints that cleared my father's name, and I had the medical trail that implicated Beatrice in the attempted murder of her own son. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I had one more stop to make. I went to the Sterling Holdings penthouse. Arthur Sterling was waiting for me. He looked tired. "Elena, it's 3 a.m. This better be about the title dispute." "It's better than that, Arthur," I said, dropping the toxicological report on his glass table. "It's about a hostile takeover of a life. And I'm going to need your help to perform the final surgery." The secret was out. The pieces were on the board. And for the first time in this 4-hour nightmare, I wasn't the one who was afraid. Justice is often described as a blind goddess, but in New York, she's a predator that only strikes when the scent of blood is strongest. I wasn't just bringing a lawsuit, I was bringing an ending. It was 10 a.m. The Vane family office was a sanctuary of velvet curtains and mahogany desks in the Upper East Side. Beatrice sat behind her desk, looking like a queen in exile, waiting for me to hand over the keys to my father's kingdom. She had her lawyers ready. She had her superior Liane papers on the table. She didn't know I had Arthur Sterling in my pocket, and a toxicologist on speed dial. "You're late, Elena," Beatrice said, her voice like frozen honey. "I assume you have the signed handover for the Project Phoenix land rights." "I have something better, Beatrice," I said, walking to the center of the room. I didn't sit. I didn't offer my hand. I signaled to the door. In walked Arthur Sterling, followed by Julian and a man in a plain gray suit from the district attorney's office. Beatrice's face remained a mask of stone, but I saw the way her hand tightened around her crystal glass. "What is this?" she asked. "This is the end of the Vane legacy," I said. "Arthur, would you like to explain the new strategic partnership?" Arthur stepped forward, his voice a gravelly rumble. "I've reviewed the title records provided by Elena. The letter you used as leverage to force this merger? It's a fraudulent document. My forensic team has already matched the ink to a printer manufactured in 2018. It's a forgery, Beatrice, and since you used it to attempt a hostile takeover of a Sterling-partnered firm, you've committed interstate wire fraud. But that's just the financial part." I interrupted, leaning over her desk until I could see the tiny cracks in her foundation. "Let's talk about Marcus. Let's talk about the vitamins you've been giving him. I dropped the toxicological report on top of her lean papers. Arsenic, Beatrice. Low doses. Just enough to make him confused. Just enough to make him look like he was losing his mind so you could take control of his voting shares. You weren't protecting him. You were harvesting him. The mask finally slipped, her face contorted into something ancient and ugly. He was weak, she hissed. He was letting you take everything. I built this family. I wasn't going to let a girl from Brooklyn drive us into the dirt. The girl from Brooklyn is the one who just called the police, I whispered. The DA is already at the private clinic, Beatrice. They're seizing the medical records. And Marcus? He's been moved to a state facility under my protection. He's already given a statement. The man in the gray suit stepped forward. Beatrice Vane, you are under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to defraud, and witness tampering. As they led her out in handcuffs, she didn't scream. She just stared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. I stood in her office, surrounded by the ghosts of her greed, and I felt nothing. No joy. No relief. Just the cold realization that the cage was finally open. I walked back to the car where Julian was waiting. It's done, I said. Not quite, Julian replied, handing me a new set of papers. The Sterling deal is still on the table, but they've changed the terms. They want you to run the entire Harlem development. No partners, no board, just you. I looked at the New York skyline. It didn't look like a map of money anymore. It looked like a challenge. The retaliation was over. The justice was served. But as I looked at the blueprints one last time, I realized that the hardest part was just beginning, rebuilding. 3 months later, the dust has finally settled over the construction site in Harlem. The gray, jagged skeletons of Marcus's cheap steel have been torn out and replaced with the grade 8 industrial alloy my father's designs always demanded. I'm standing on the balcony of a new office, not the penthouse in Tribeca, but a studio in Brooklyn that smells of fresh cedar and ink. I realized I didn't want to live in a glass cage anymore. I wanted to be closer to the ground, where the foundations are laid. Marcus is in a specialized medical wing now. The arsenic is out of his system, but the damage to his nervous system, that's a ledger that can't be balanced. The doctors say he has islands of clarity. Sometimes he remembers the firm. Sometimes he remembers the betrayal. But most of the time, he just remembers the smell of the lilies in our old apartment. I visited him yesterday. He sat by the window, looking at a bird on the sill. He didn't look like a villain. He didn't look like a predator. He just looked like a man who had tried to outrun his own shadow and tripped. Elena, he whispered, his eyes focusing for just a second. Did we finish the project? I'm finishing it, Marcus, I said, sitting across from him. I didn't reach for his hand. That bridge was burned long ago, and I am an architect who knows when a structure is beyond repair. The Harlem site is going to be beautiful. Good, he sighed, drifting back into the fog. I wanted you to have something beautiful. It's the great irony of my life. He tried to destroy me to save me. He lied to me to protect me. We spend our lives building walls to keep people out, only to realize the person we let inside was the one holding the sledgehammer. Beatrice's trial is set for next spring. She's fighting every charge, of course. She's hired the best lawyers money can buy, but money can't erase the chemical signature of arsenic in a blood sample. She will die in a cell, surrounded by the silence she earned. Julian and I are speaking. We aren't friends yet. Trust is like a skyscraper. It takes years to build and seconds to implode. But he's the head of the site operations now. He's found his own path, away from the shadow of our father's ghost. I sat down at my drafting table this morning and looked at a blank sheet of paper. For the first time in 10 years there was no Sterling logo. No Vane Family Trust. No Apex Consulting. Just a line. A single, honest line. I realized then that the golden cage wasn't the penthouse or the firm. It was the belief that my worth was tied to what I owned. Marcus thought he was taking my assets, but he was actually doing me a favor. He was stripping away the ornaments until all that was left was the structure. 1 year later, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Vane Heritage Center in Harlem didn't make the front page for scandal. It made the front page for the architecture. I stood in the plaza, watching children run through the fountain and elderly couples sit on the benches made of reclaimed timber from the original site. I didn't wear a hard hat this time. I wore a simple black dress and my father's old watch, the one Marcus thought he had destroyed, but which Julian had found and painstakingly restored. Arthur Sterling was there. He stayed in the back, nodding at me from a distance. We aren't friends. We are two people who understand the cost of doing business in a city that eats the weak. He has his land, and I have my name. In New York, that's as close to a happy ending as you get. As I looked up at the building, the cantilevered glass, the reinforced steel, the way the light hit the limestone, I realized something I wish I had known 10 years ago. A building isn't just a place to live. It's a physical manifestation of a choice. Every brick is a decision. Every beam is a sacrifice. My marriage was a building with a beautiful facade and a hollow foundation. It looked grand from the street, but it couldn't survive a storm. I spent so much time trying to be the perfect architect for everyone else, the perfect wife for Marcus, the perfect daughter for my father's ghost, the perfect CEO for the board, that I forgot to check the structural integrity of my own soul. Beatrice Vane was sentenced to 25 years last month. She didn't look like a queen in the courtroom. She looked like a fragile, bitter old woman who had poisoned everything she touched. Marcus is stable now, living in a quiet facility upstate. He doesn't remember the embezzlement. He doesn't remember the arsenic. He only remembers that he once loved a woman who built things that reached for the sky. I don't visit him anymore. Sometimes, the most merciful thing you can do for a person and for yourself is to let the past remain the past. If you are watching this and you feel the walls closing in, if you feel the person next to you moving the bricks while you sleep, listen to me. You are not the cage they built for you. You are the architect. They can take your money. They can take your home. They can even try to take your name. But they cannot take the part of you that knows how to create. I lost $40 million. I lost a 10-year marriage. I lost the man I thought was my hero. And yet, as I stand here today, I have never been wealthier. Because now, when I look in the mirror, I don't see a vain asset. I see Elena. And Elena knows how to build. We've reached the end. You've watched a woman be dismantled and put back together piece by piece. Most of you will close this tab and feel a sense of relief that this isn't your life. But look around your room. Look at your bank account. Look at the person sitting across from you. Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure the foundation is solid? Subscribe now. Not for me, but for the version of you that might need to remember this story when the ground starts to shake. If you choose to walk away now, stay in the comments and tell me why you think you're the one person the world won't try to break. I'll be there, waiting to see who's building and who's just waiting to fall. The sun is setting over the Hudson now. It's orange, violet and beautiful. And for the first time in my life, the air is perfectly clear.